Nadia Osei had learned to iron her own clothes at the age of 9. Not because her mother couldn't do it, but because her mother worked 2 jobs and came home with her feet swollen and her eyes already half closed before she reached the kitchen. And Nadia had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that she would stop being one more thing that needed doing. That was how she moved through the world, quietly, without making herself a problem. She was 31 now, standing in front of a hotel bathroom mirror, in a black dress that she had ironed herself the night before, pressing the collar flat with the kind of focus most people reserved for things that mattered more. Outside the window, the city was already moving. 40 nations had sent their best people to this summit. Cars lined the boulevard below, flags she could name without looking. She knew this world. She had spent 6 years learning its language, not the official one spoken at podiums, but the real one. The one whispered near catering tables and traded in elevator rides between floors. She knew which advisors actually wrote the policies their kings signed. She knew which delegations arrived early because they were prepared, and which ones arrived early because they were nervous. She also knew that Draven Vasile would be there. She set the iron down, picked up her credentials badge, clipped it to her lapel. She had known for 3 weeks that he would attend. She had processed the information the way she processed most difficult things. She filed it somewhere quiet and kept moving. By now the information had settled. It no longer made her stomach tighten when she thought about it. At least that was what she told herself, while she walked through the lobby. The summit hall was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel small in a flattering way. High ceilings, pale stone floors that reflected the light, long windows overlooking formal gardens that no one ever actually walked in, the kind of beauty that existed to be seen from a distance. Nadia had been assigned to the Trade Policy Working Group, which met in a smaller room down the hall, and she was grateful for it. She had a briefing to finish, 2 follow-up questions from the Meridian delegation to answer in writing, and a printed schedule that she was already mentally adjusting based on the traffic she had observed between the east and west wings. She worked steadily through the morning. She did not look for him. He found her anyway. It was late afternoon, the hour when summits like this one began to loosen slightly. When the formal sessions ended and people gathered in the spaces between, near the tall windows and the catering stations, holding drinks they were not really drinking, talking about things they were not really saying. Nadia had stepped out to the east terrace for air. The gardens were golden in the late light. She was reading a message on her phone when she heard the footsteps stop beside her. She did not need to look up to know. There are people whose presence arrives before they do. Draven Vasile was one of them. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Accord, a title that carried the weight of 12 nations, a security detail, and a reputation built over 15 years of political decisions that were always correct and occasionally brutal. He was the kind of man rooms reorganized themselves around. She had once been the person he trusted to tell him when he was wrong. "Nadia," he said. She looked up from her phone. She kept her face still. That was a skill she had also learned young. "Draven," she said. He had clearly thought about this moment. She could see it in the careful way he was standing, not with his usual ease, but with a slight stiffness that meant he had rehearsed. His hands were in front of him, loosely joined. His security detail had created a 10-foot circle of empty space around them, which meant this conversation had been planned. He spoke for almost 2 minutes. He was precise about it. He acknowledged what had happened 3 years ago, the way he had removed her from her position without warning, without consultation, without any acknowledgement of what she had contributed. He acknowledged that it had been wrong. He used the word wrong twice. He said that he had carried it and that he wanted her to know. It was a good apology. She recognized that. It had none of the usual escapes, none of the, "if you felt hurt," or "I'm sorry you experienced," language that powerful people used when they wanted the appearance of accountability without the weight of it. He was direct. He was specific. He looked at her while he said it. She listened to every word. When he finished, the terrace was quiet, except for the sound of the gardens below and the low hum of the building behind them. She said, "I know." 2 words. No anger in them, no warmth either, just the simple, clean acknowledgement of someone who had already done the work of understanding what had happened to her and had done it without him. She held his gaze for one moment longer. Then she turned and walked back through the terrace doors. She collected a glass of mineral water from the nearest station and found a seat near the window at the far end of the main hall. She crossed her legs, opened her phone, and returned to the brief she had been reading before the afternoon sessions. Her left hand was shaking slightly. She noticed it. She pressed her palm flat against her knee and held it there until the shaking stopped. Then she kept reading. The room around her was doing what rooms like that always did with information, processing it, passing it from one small group to another, attaching meaning to it, embellishing it slightly with each transfer. She was aware, without looking, that people were aware. She was aware that what had just happened on the terrace was already being described in at least 3 different conversations happening within 50 feet of where she was sitting. She did not look up. She read about grain tariffs. There was a dispute between the Eastern Coalition and 2 Mid-Belt nations about import ceilings, and the brief she had been given offered 3 possible frameworks for resolution, 2 of which she thought were incomplete. She pulled out a pen and made a small note in the margin. She was so focused on the note that she did not immediately notice the man who had sat down in the chair across from her. "You have marked that page," he said. She looked up. She knew who he was. King Sebastião Reyes Monteiro of the Southern Alliance, a confederation of 7 nations that had spent the last decade becoming the most economically stable group on the southern continent. He was known for 3 things: his silence in public forums, his precision in private ones, and the fact that his administration had not had a major policy failure in 8 years. That last one, Nadia had always thought, was the most impressive. He was looking at her notepad. "The Kaplan Framework," he said, nodding at the brief. "You think it is wrong." "I think it is incomplete," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the internal movement that comes before one. "Tell me," he said. She told him. For 11 minutes they sat across from each other in a room full of some of the most important people on the continent, and talked about grain import ceilings, with the focused intensity of 2 people who found this sort of thing genuinely interesting. He pushed back on one of her points. She pushed back on his pushback. He made a concession. She made a smaller one. At the end of it, he said, "You are right about the mid-belt threshold. I have been looking at it wrong." She said, "Most people do." He looked out at the room for a moment. When he looked back, his voice had shifted slightly, quieter, more deliberate. "My senior advisory council has had an empty seat for 6 months," he said. "I have been slow to fill it because I have been waiting for someone I could not argue past." He paused. "That is not an offer," he said. "That is the beginning of a conversation about whether you would want one." Nadia set her pen down on top of the brief. She understood what he was describing. Senior Policy Counsel to the Southern Alliance Crown was not a decoration. It was not a ceremonial position, created to make someone feel valued. It came with a diplomatic passport, a formal title that sat above most of the people she currently worked alongside, and a seat at every table that mattered in the southern half of the world. It also meant, practically speaking, that she would occupy the same professional level as Draven Vasil, not beneath him, not seeking access to the rooms he controlled, beside him. She noticed that she noticed that. She looked at Sebastião Reyes Monteiro and understood that he was not a man who said imprecise things. The words he had used, "someone I could not argue past," were specific. They were an assessment, not a compliment. He had read her briefs. He knew the difference between someone who was smart and someone who was useful, and he was telling her, in the plainest language available to someone in his position, that he believed she was the second kind. She thought about the East Terrace, about Draven's careful, rehearsed apology, and the silence that had followed her 2-word response. She thought about the 3 years between that moment and this one, the months of rebuilding her professional contacts from scratch, of working twice as hard in smaller rooms to be given access to slightly larger ones, of waking up at 5 in the morning to finish analysis that other people would present under their own names. She thought about her mother, coming home with swollen feet. She thought about a 9-year-old girl who had decided to stop being one more thing that needed doing. She looked at her mineral water. She looked at her notepad. She looked at the man sitting across from her, who was waiting without impatience, who had asked his question and was now simply present, giving her the space to think, without filling it with more words. That, she thought, was itself a form of intelligence. "The empty seat," she said. "Tell me about it." He did. They talked for another 40 minutes. By the time they finished, the hall had thinned considerably. The evening reception had started in the East Wing, and most people had drifted toward it. Their corner of the room had the quiet of a space that had been briefly forgotten by the rest of the event. He stood when it was time to go. He did not offer his hand. He gave her a small, formal nod, the kind that meant, "This was worth my time," in the language of men like him. "You will receive a formal communication within the week," he said. "I know," she said. He left. She sat for a moment longer. The formal offer arrived on a Thursday, 4 days after the summit ended. It was written in the careful, precise language of official Crown correspondence, but the terms were exactly what he had described. She read it twice. She made one phone call, to a lawyer she trusted, and asked 3 specific questions. She slept on it for one night. She accepted on Friday morning. She did not send any message to Draven Vasile. There was no version of this story in which she owed him one. What had happened between them was finished, not because she had forgiven and forgotten, but because she had simply moved through it until it was behind her, the way you move through a difficult stretch of road. You do not celebrate the road. You simply find yourself on the other side. The position was announced publicly 2 weeks later. She learned about the response from a colleague who had been monitoring the coverage. The announcement had been noted in 17 trade publications. Several of them mentioned, in passing, the professional history between Nadia Osei and the Northern Accord, a polite way of describing what most people in the relevant circles already knew. A few commentators described it as a striking development. One used the word remarkable. Nadia read none of it. She was already in her new office. It was a good office, not large, but well-positioned, with a window that faced south and bookshelves that were still empty and waiting. She had brought 3 things from her previous workspace: a notebook, a small framed photograph of her mother taken at a garden party 15 years ago, and the iron that she had used since she was 24. She set the photograph on the windowsill. She opened the notebook. She began. There is a version of this story that makes it about Draven Vasile, about his apology, and what it meant that she refused it. There is a version that makes it about Sebastião Reyes Monteiro, and the offer he made, and the speed with which the world rearranged itself in her favor. But the people who knew Nadia understood that neither of those versions was the real one. The real one started at age 9, with a child who looked at a situation and decided to respond to it with competence instead of complaint. It continued through 6 years of learning a world's real language, through 3 years of rebuilding after a powerful man made her inconvenient, through 100 mornings of 5 o'clock alarm clocks and margin notes on briefs that other people signed. The East Terrace was not the moment her life changed. The grain tariff conversation was not the moment her life changed. Her life had been changing the whole time. The summit was simply the day the room noticed. And Nadia Osei, who had learned at 9 years old to stop waiting for things to be done for her, had long since stopped needing the room to notice. She was already somewhere else. She was already working.